Good afternoon. Today what I want to do is talk about the pricing chapter. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to break the pricing chapter down into two parts. In today's discussion, what I want to do is talk about the various things that go into pricing, and then we'll talk about in tomorrow's section how we use pricing. And tomorrow's when I'll put up the quiz for this particular chapter. So let's start off with a discussion of what is price. Price is a lot more than the number you see on the sticker or the electronic piece you see when you go to the gas station. Prices are carefully thought out by marketers and account for everything from the cost to the competitive situation they're in. Now, what we want to think about up front is that when a consumer looks at the price of something, they're looking at it from a value perspective. Their main consideration is, for what I'm having to give up, am I getting something of greater value? Not comparable value, but the greater value. Value should always exceed the price. If it doesn't, then consumers really become ambivalent about what's going on. So when you're thinking about price, you got to think about the sacrifice consumers are making. And they're making a variety of sacrifices, not just handing you cash or running their card. The sacrifice they're making is the time it takes to get something. One reason that people will often leave a retailer is they think it's taking too long for the transaction to take place. They don't see a value for the price they were going to pay. You'll often see this online too, where if the checkout process is too complicated, people will often what's called bulk out of a purchase because the sacrifice in terms of time is too high to justify the price point being charged. We also want to take a look at psychologically, what does price pay? If you remember back to the chapter where we talked about the influence of cultures and subcultures, here's where we see that on the price side. If something is highly visible and people can see it and know what the price is, it has a very big influence on a consumer's decision to buy it. It's why people buy Rolex watches. People know a Rolex is an expensive watch, so people run out and buy them to show them that they're wealthy. Same thing with expensive pens that cost $2,000 or $3,000. People buy those because the people they want to impress know that it's an expensive pen and they see value in impressing them. So what we want to take a look at with price is two things. The sacrifice consumers are willing to give up in terms of the dollars they'll exchange, the time required to do it, and I didn't mention this earlier, but what they could have spent their money on instead. So you've got to provide more value than the next best decision they could make. And what it says about the person. Does the price you're charging provide enough value to that consumer in terms of their ability to show off? Now, as you go deeper into the chapter, it gets into a discussion of revenue and profit. Well, revenue will remind you a lot of your econ course. Revenue is nothing more than the price you're going to charge the consumer or the user, if it's an industrial sale, multiplied by the number of units you intend to sell. Profitability takes into account the costs associated with selling those units. So the costs that break down into variable and fixed costs. And the difference between a variable and a fixed cost, if you're not in accounting or don't remember from econ, is variable costs are directly tied to the unit being sold. Fixed costs stay the same over a volume area or a certain volume number of units, certain volume of units sold. Okay, great example, and it's one I use in class all the time, is if you think about a clubhouse sandwich. Here are the variable costs in a clubhouse sandwich. The bread, the mayo, the bacon, the chicken, the tomato, the lettuce, the salt and the pepper, and whatever, let's say we put some avocado on, the avocado. Okay, those are the variable costs. Plus we've got to toast it, so we can put that in the variable cost as well. And we can put a little bit of labor in there because we know how long it takes to assemble this sandwich. So we've got about 10 things that are variable costs. And what we can do is we can build that up, and that gives us a cost structure of that sandwich. Now the issue is that that sandwich also has some fixed costs associated with it. The fixed costs are the cost of the kitchen, which we need regardless of how many sandwiches we make. The knife that we're using. The prep cook who chops up the lettuce. The bowls that are used. The spoons that are used. The knives that are used. All the things that we can't readily assign to that particular sandwich, those are fixed costs. And those include everything from marketing is usually a fixed cost because we can't assign it to an individual unit. Well, we could, but it's not a good idea and not something that we heavily use in business. To your HR costs. So now what you've got is you've got the revenue, price times quantity, okay? From that, we subtract out the variable costs, or the cost of goods sold, it can be referred to as well. That gives us what's called the gross margin. From the gross margin, we select off all of those, or subtract off, not select off, but subtract off all of those fixed costs to get us down to the net margin, which we call profit, net profit, before tax. This is a no tax world. We'll pretend we're living in Texas, where there's no taxes. So now what you've got is an idea about how your business works, whether we can play around with revenue, whether we want to focus on fixed costs or variable costs or whatever. Now we want to start coming up with a pricing model. Now we could go for a profit-oriented model. Some companies want to make sure that there's a wide differential between the revenue received and the cost of the product, the variable cost of the product. Medical devices fall into that category. Alcohol sales they usually have a much bigger margin than, let's say, food sales, okay? Whatever the product is, and this can be unique to your industry, you're going to charge a price that is, if you're profit-oriented, gives you a certain amount of profit per unit. Now, on the other extreme, you've got Walmart. Walmart works on a volume piece. They take a very small profit per unit, but they multiply it out by millions of units to get pretty much the same level of profitability as somebody who charges a lot and makes a big profit per unit, but sells considerably less of them. And for the most part, Walmart has tended to knock out the guys that had the big profit margins because they found consumers were very price conscious. So if you don't want to use the profit-oriented approach, you can use what's called a sales-oriented approach. A lot of Japanese firms prefer the sales-oriented approach. They want to get a big market share and then use that to create customers who come back on a continual basis. They do that because they're in it for the long haul, whereas companies that tend to use a profit approach tend to be much more transactional. They're in and out of the market fairly quickly. Okay, so you can use a sales approach. And if you're doing that, then you're going to see more of a market share piece. The next thing we can talk about is what demand issues really determine how much we charge. Well, one is basic economics. If the economy is booming, typically we raise our prices because people have more money. If the economy is down, we can't raise our prices because people don't have a lot of money. We take a look at the elasticity of demand, which I'm sure you also remember from your econ course. And what we're looking at there is if we change the price by X%, what happens to demand? If it's highly elastic, it'll go down more than X. If it's inelastic, it'll go down, but not as much as X. And if it's unitary elastic, it'll change exactly at what X is. So if we raise price 10% in a unitary elasticity, demand drops by 10%. We also, when we're looking at elasticity, want to factor in what really determines how elastic a demand is for a particular product. So think about what are things that drive elasticity. Well, number one is substitutes. The more substitutes you have for something, the more elastic demand is. Now think about that. Let's take gasoline, for example. Right now, we're heavily reliant on the internal combustion engine still. So gasoline has a relatively inelastic demand. We can raise the price of gas. It's not going to have a major impact on how much gas is purchased because people still need it to run their vehicles, and they still need their vehicles to get stuff done. Now, in the long term, we might see more of a shift over to electric or hydrogen power or something else, but in the short run, fairly inelastic. Compare that to an area like beer, where there's lots of substitutes. And there, if you drop the price on, let's say, Miller Lite, you might see their sales spike up because they're very elastic. There's lots of substitutes. People go, I'm not going to buy Bush this week. I'm going to go there because it's less expensive. We see that all the time in the grocery industry, where people usually have 2 or 3 stores they like to go to, and they switch between those 2 or 3 based upon who's got a sale on that week. We want to take a look at the product durability. The more a product is durable, the less elastic it is. So if you've got a product that you know is going to break down, it's highly elastic. Price change, people will switch. And what we've seen in appliances, which used to be the picture of durability, is now companies are making them less and less expensively because they know consumers are very price conscious. So they've shortened down the lifespan to account for the fact that consumers didn't have a lot of money, and we're buying cheap products and going, yeah, I'm getting value if it lasts 5 years, when my previous one lasted 10 years. Not getting value today, I'm willing to spend this amount for 5 years. Okay. Last but not least is other uses. And the more uses a product has, the less elastic its demand is. If it's got a single use, it can be very elastic. So that really impacts how things work. Now, if you go into the aviation industry or the hotel industry, or the rental car industry, you're likely to run into, also the concert and festival industries. You're likely to run into two concepts that are unique to those. They're called dynamic pricing and yield management. And the reason why they're unique to those industries is because those are basically services. And because one of the core differentiators between a product and a service is that a service is perishable. Once the service starts, it's gone. You can't go back and restart it. That tends to drive different pricing models. In dynamic pricing, which you see a lot of in the festival market, and some sports teams have used it, the price of a seat will change based upon demand at a given time and demand for that particular team that's playing. So we see a bit of that here at UND, that ticket prices for the Fighting Hawks tend to change based upon the opponent, with more important opponents like NDSU or University of Minnesota earning higher ticket prices because people are willing to pay that to see those because of the rivalry, but less likely to pay if it's somebody like Western Michigan or somebody like that, or Eastern Michigan. So dynamic pricing is always changing based upon supply and demand at any given time. And what that's designed to do is capture as much underneath the old intersection of the supply and demand curve as possible. The other area you see used is yield management, heavily used in industries where there's a high fixed cost associated with it. Airlines, cruise ships, hotels, rental cars. And what happens in yield management is they figure out how many consumers are likely to buy at certain price points, and they set those price points up. And what they're trying to do is maximize their revenue. It's a form of sales-oriented pricing, actually. They're trying to maximize their revenue at each one of those price points. So you do see those two in operation. And I've posted a video for you on how airlines set pricing, which explains that out to you in a bit of detail. The next area to consider is the cost. We've already talked about the fixed and the variable costs. There's two things I want to talk to you about here. If you know the if you know the variable cost of an item and you know the markup percentage, so let's use a typical markup, which is called a keystone, 50%. If you know an item costs $10 and has a 50% markup, the question is, what's the price? A lot of you are going to say $15. $10 times 1.5. Wrong. The way you calculate price, if you know the cost and the markup, is to take the cost and divide it by 1 minus that markup percentage. So in our case, it's going to be 10 divided by 1 minus 0.5, which is 10 divided by 0.5, which is $20. So make sure you remember that. Cost divided by 1 minus the markup percent will give you the price. The second thing to remember is the break-even point in units. To calculate out break-even point in units, take your fixed cost and divide it by price minus variable cost. So let's assume we go further with the example I just gave you. We know the price is we know the price is 20. We know our cost is 10. And let's say there's a $100,000 fixed cost associated with that. What's our break even in units? Well, it's 100,000 divided by 20, our price, minus 10, our variable cost, or 100,000 divided by 10, or 10,000 units is our break even. So now what you've got is two critical things we need to understand for pricing: how to calculate out what our price is and how to calculate out what our break even is. Because until we break even, we have to pay for the product. After break even, everything else becomes more of a profit for us. All right, the last thing we want to talk about is what are the major other considerations? Well, one at the top of the list is life cycle. The earlier you are in the life cycle of a product, the more you can charge. That makes sense. Remember, who's at the beginning of a product life cycle? Those innovators, the innovators right up front. They'll pay anything to solve the problem because they want to be the first people to solve it. That's why whenever new flat screen TVs come out, the first year they're always horrendously expensive. Well, the reason why is small demand at that point. So you're spreading your costs over a smaller area, which drives up your fixed cost per unit. And you've got people who want to have the latest and the greatest technology, the curve technology, the 8K technology, whatever it is. They're willing to pay a huge premium for that. As you go through the product life cycle, your price drops for two key reasons. One is more competitors are coming in, and as you get more competition, people start to compete based on price, especially as they can start to drive their cost structure down. And two is consumers become much more price sensitive as you go through the system, as you go through the life cycle. So life cycle plays a big role. The competition plays a big role. I've already talked a bit about that. But the more competitors you have, the more your price is kept down. At the extreme of that, if you're from an if you live on a farm, you understand this better than anybody, are commodities. Commodities are always low price because there's so many people providing it, nobody can raise the price. There's always somebody willing to provide it for a lower price. So commodities really show you where there's a massive competitive market that keeps prices down. In markets where there's not a competitive market, you find prices tend to be more expensive. A lot of people say the reason gas is more expensive in Grand Forks versus Fargo is because Fargo has more competitors. where here it's a less competitive situation. Could be true. Could also be partially due to the extra cost of transporting here, but I would take a look at the competitive piece. And the last thing to consider about in price is the demand of your large customers. And the example I'll give you for this one is Walmart. Remember I said Walmart likes to make its money not on individual units, but based upon selling thousands or millions of units. They take that same approach when they go after companies that are selling to them. What they do is they're constantly driving down the price so they can have their price rollbacks that you see. The way they do that is they go to the company and say, look, guys, we've run the numbers. We understand the elasticity of your product. We understand our customer base. If we drop the price of the product by 40 cents, we're going to see demand increase of this, which if you can drop your price by 20 cents, you're going to see demand increase at the same rate. And we've done the math, and based upon what we know about your cost structure, you're going to make slightly more by lowering your price 20 cents to us and allowing us to sell more units. Now, sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. But that's a great way where large customers drive your pricing. You also tend to see that in a lot of government contracts where the government tends to drive the pricing, again, for good or evil. So there you go, the first half of pricing. Tomorrow we'll be back and we'll take a look at adjustments to price that we make as marketers to help get greater sales. So have a great night, and I'll see you tomorrow.